Chapter 1: The New Normal. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows on the living room of the quaint house in suburban Ohio. The air was crisp, a soft reminder that the fall season was drawing to an end. In the small town of Maplewood, everything seemed calm, predictable, and ordinary. For Andrea Carlson, life had found its rhythm again after years of turbulent changes. But beneath the surface, there were whispers of uncertainty, and the illusion of peace began to crack. Andrea, a woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair and piercing blue eyes, stood at the kitchen counter, preparing breakfast. The sizzling sound of eggs cooking on the skillet was drowned out by the murmur of the news on the television. Her daughter, Emily, was sitting at the kitchen table, her small feet dangling from the chair as she absent-mindedly played with her cereal. Andrea smiled at the sight, feeling a rare moment of contentment, a sense of normalcy that had been hard to come by in recent years. It had been 6 months since Andrea married David, a man she met through a mutual friend at a work conference. David was the kind of man who seemed too good to be true: handsome, charming, successful. He had a steady job as a financial consultant at a top firm in Cleveland, and he seemed to truly care about Emily, treating her like his own daughter. They had settled into a new life in Maplewood, far from the chaos of city life, and things were starting to feel like they could be okay. But something about their life felt off. Andrea had no reason to doubt David, no concrete evidence, at least. He was a good man, kind, considerate, loving. Yet there were moments, little moments that passed unnoticed by everyone else, when Andrea felt a gnawing unease in her gut. The way David would linger too long on his phone, the odd late-night phone calls he'd take in another room. And there was the matter of his odd behavior around the house. He was constantly moving things around, adjusting little things, always cleaning up after himself in a way that seemed far too meticulous for someone who had always been so laid back. But today, it wasn't his behavior that was bothering Andrea. "Mom, don't drink from that cup," Emily suddenly shouted, her voice sharp with alarm. Andrea froze, the mug of coffee halfway to her lips. Emily's wide, innocent eyes were fixed on her, a look of sheer panic etched on her small face. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Andrea asked, setting the cup down and kneeling beside her daughter. "Don't drink from that one," Emily repeated, her voice trembling. "The new mama put something in there. I saw her." Andrea's heart skipped a beat. The words sent a chill down her spine, but she tried to keep her composure. Emily had been acting strangely lately, as children sometimes do when adjusting to new routines, but this was unsettling. "Emily, what are you talking about? What do you mean, put something in there?" Andrea's voice was steady, but she could feel her pulse quicken. "I saw her, Mommy," Emily insisted, her little hands clenched tightly around the edge of her cereal bowl. "She was holding the cup, and then she put something in it when you weren't looking. She said it was special for you." Andrea's mind raced. David had always been kind to Emily, never once giving her any reason to fear him. But the last few days, there had been an edge to their interactions. Emily had become more withdrawn, more anxious. Andrea chalked it up to the stress of the transition, the new home, the new family dynamic. But now, hearing her daughter speak with such conviction, a terrible thought started to take root in Andrea's mind. Could David really be hiding something from her? Could he be capable of something dangerous? "Emily, honey, come here," Andrea said, gently taking her daughter's hand and leading her to the couch. "We need to talk about this. You're not in trouble, but I need you to tell me exactly what you saw." The little girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I saw her. She had the cup and then she put something in it. She said it was for you to make you feel better. And then she put it in the drawer and told me to stay out of the kitchen." Andrea's stomach twisted into a knot. David had always been attentive, but this sudden secrecy, this strange behavior, it didn't sit right. She had to know more. "Stay here, Emily," Andrea said softly, her voice calm but her mind racing. "I'll be right back." She walked into the kitchen, the empty cup still sitting on the counter where she had left it. It looked normal, just an ordinary coffee cup, the same one she used every morning. There was nothing unusual about it. But then, Why did Emily react so strongly? What could she have seen? Andrea opened the drawer where David kept the coffee supplies, sugar, stirrers, and the coffee filters. There, buried beneath a pile of napkins, she found something strange. A small vial, tucked into the corner. It was opaque, the contents inside a deep, reddish-brown liquid. Her breath caught in her throat. What was this? Why would David hide this here? Before she could reach for the vial, she heard the sound of the front door opening. David's voice echoed through the house, followed by the soft click of his shoes on the hardwood floor. "Hey, Han. I'm home early today," David called, his voice cheerful. "What's going on? You look pale." Andrea quickly closed the drawer and turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. "David," she said, her voice tight, "what's in the cup?" "Emily said something strange this morning. Is there something you need to tell me?" David's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough to make Andrea's suspicions flare. He walked closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, but Andrea could feel the tension in his touch. "Sweetie, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice smooth, but there was something about his eyes, something evasive. "I found something, David," Andrea said, her voice trembling as she tried to control the surge of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "What's in that cup? And what is this?" She pulled the vial out of the drawer, holding it up in front of him. David's expression shifted, a flicker of panic passing over his face before he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Andrea, it's nothing really, just some vitamins. You know I've been trying to help you with your health, with everything going on." Andrea took a step back, the vial still in her hand. "Vitamins?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "David, this doesn't look like any vitamin I've ever seen." David sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to worry you. I've been worried about you, Andrea. You've been so stressed lately, and I thought what?" Andrea interrupted, her voice rising. "That I needed something to feel better? What is this really, David? What is going on?" David's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Andrea saw something in him that sent a chill down her spine. Fear, yes, but also something far darker, something she couldn't quite place. I didn't want to tell you," David said quietly, his voice now serious. "I thought if I could help you, maybe we could avoid what's coming." "What's coming?" Andrea whispered, her voice barely audible. David stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, but Andrea recoiled instinctively, a feeling of dread washing over her. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice low, full of regret. "I never wanted you to find out like this, but I've been doing everything I can to protect you, Andrea." "Protect me from what?" she asked, her voice breaking. David looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. "From something you don't understand yet. Something you won't understand until it's too late." Chapter 2. The Hidden Truth. The house felt colder now, the walls seeming to close in on Andrea as David stood before her, his expression unreadable. Her mind spun with questions, yet she couldn't bring herself to ask him more. She could only stare at the vial in her hand, the small object suddenly feeling far more dangerous than it had any right to be. David took a step back, as if giving her space, though his eyes never left hers. "Andrea," he began, his voice soft, almost too soft. "There are things I didn't want to burden you with, things you weren't ready to know." Andrea's heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts raced. He was keeping secrets, big ones, and she was just now realizing how little she actually knew about the man she had married. I don't understand, David," she said, her voice shaky as she looked down at the vial once more. It felt like a small, cruel piece of a puzzle that she had no idea how to solve. "What is this? What are you trying to protect me from? And why didn't you tell me? Why keep things from me like this?" David sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly as he ran a hand through his hair. He seemed defeated, as if the weight of what he had been hiding had finally become too much to carry. For a moment it looked like he might break down, but instead he composed himself. His eyes met hers, filled with an intensity that took Andrea off guard. "I didn't want to frighten you, Andrea. I thought I could handle it myself. But now, I see I can't. His voice wavered slightly, but he quickly regained control. The truth is, there are things happening in this world that you don't understand. Things beyond our control. And I've been working with people who want to protect us. Protect us from what? Andrea demanded, her patience thinning. You've got to be more specific than that. What do you mean? What's going on? David took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how to explain it all. The seconds stretched into eternity, and Andrea could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. She needed answers. Now, you're not sick, Andrea, he began, his voice tight with the weight of what he was about to reveal. At least not in the way you think. There's a disease, a kind of infection that's been spreading in secret, and it's deadly. You've been exposed to it. Andrea felt the ground beneath her shift. What do you mean I've been exposed to it? You're saying I have some kind of infection? But I'm fine, no symptoms, nothing. I feel perfectly fine. Her voice faltered, uncertainty creeping in. David closed his eyes briefly, as if weighing his next words. It's not something that shows up right away. The effects are gradual, but they're catastrophic. I've been trying to find a way to stop it, Andrea. And I've been working with specialists, trying to figure out how to protect you. Andrea's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. A disease? A secret infection? This felt like something straight out of a medical thriller. A nightmare that was too bizarre to be real. But the look in David's eyes, his desperate, almost pleading gaze, made her realize that he wasn't lying. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Andrea whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of confusion, fear, and betrayal. Why keep it a secret? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth? David swallowed hard, the strain on his face evident. Because I thought I could find a way to fix it without you knowing. I didn't want you to worry, didn't want to burden you with something that could break you. But I can't protect you anymore. I need you to understand the danger we're in. Andrea was silent for a moment, her thoughts tumbling over each other. She had always trusted David, always believed that he was someone who could handle anything. But now, this revelation felt like a slap to her face. How could he have kept something so important from her? She was his wife. She deserved to know. I don't know what to believe right now, she admitted, her voice quiet. It's just too much, David. I don't know what's real anymore. David stepped forward, gently reaching for her hand. His touch was warm, but it did little to ease the knot of fear and doubt that had formed in Andrea's chest. I know this is hard to understand. Believe me, I wish I could explain it all to you. But the situation is complicated. There are people involved, people you don't know, people I can't explain to you right now. But I promise, I'm doing everything I can to protect you. Andrea stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke, some twisted fantasy. But there was no deception in his eyes, only fear. Fear for her. I need to know everything, David. Every single detail, Andrea said, her voice now firm, resolute. You've kept me in the dark for far too long. I need to know what's going on, and I need to know how I can protect Emily and myself. David nodded, his face softening with relief, though his eyes still held that edge of worry. I'll tell you everything, but not here, not now. It's too dangerous. There are people watching us. Andrea's heart raced again. She had never imagined her life would come to this. A secret infection? A conspiracy? She looked at the vial once more, now understanding its true significance. It was a symbol of everything David had been hiding, everything she was only beginning to uncover. What happens now? She asked, the words heavy with the weight of what they were facing. David hesitated, then spoke in a low, urgent tone. We need to leave, Andrea. I've already made arrangements. There are people who can help us, but we need to move quickly. We need to get Emily and go. There's no time to waste. Andrea's mind was still reeling, but she nodded. She knew what they had to do. Her family's safety was at stake. She had to trust David, even though every part of her wanted to run from the secrets he had kept. I'll get Emily, she said, her voice trembling but determined. We're in this together, but you're going to have to tell me everything, David. No more secrets. David's expression softened, and for a fleeting moment, Andrea could see the man she had married, the man who cared for her, who loved her. But that man was no longer the only one standing before her. The truth had changed everything. And as they hurried to prepare for the uncertain journey ahead, Andrea couldn't shake the feeling that their lives would never be the same again. The door to their future had opened, and the unknown awaited them. Chapter 3: Unraveling the Past. The car's tires hummed against the cold asphalt as Andrea sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The countryside of Ohio passed by in blurred streaks of gold and green, the early morning light casting long shadows across the landscape. Beside her, David drove in silence, his grip on the wheel tight, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He had told her to pack quickly, just the essentials, no time to waste. But what exactly were they running from? And what awaited them at their destination? Andrea's mind raced with questions she couldn't yet answer. David had insisted they couldn't talk about it until they were on their way, out of Maplewood. The house, the town, everything familiar had been left behind. She had been forced to trust him, to trust that his cryptic explanations were grounded in something real. But what if she was making a mistake? What if David had been hiding things for a reason, and now they were on the edge of a nightmare that could destroy everything? "Where are we going?" Andrea finally broke the silence, her voice a mixture of concern and confusion. David's jaw tightened, and he glanced at her briefly, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the road, steering them onto a smaller highway that wound through dense woods. The scenery was quiet, almost eerie in its stillness. "Just trust me," he said, his voice flat, his expression unreadable. "It's the safest place for now. The less you know, the better." Andrea clenched her fists, the nerves in her stomach twisting tighter. She didn't want to be left in the dark any longer, not when her life, her family's life, was at stake. She needed answers. She had to know more about this mysterious infection, this disease David had warned her about. How could he expect her to just follow him, blindly, without a clearer explanation? "You keep saying that, David," Andrea pressed, her tone sharp. "But I need you to understand something. I can't keep running without knowing why. I'm not going to just trust you blindly." David's grip on the wheel tightened further, and he took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep his composure. For the first time, Andrea saw something that startled her. Fear. It wasn't just fear for her, but fear in his own eyes. Fear of what might be coming. "I didn't want you involved in this, Andrea," David said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I never wanted you to be part of this. But it's too late now. You're already in it." Andrea's heart pounded in her chest. "In what?" David hesitated, his voice dropping even lower. "The disease, it's not just an infection, Andrea. It's engineered. It's a bioweapon." Andrea's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled as the words hit her like a slap. A bioweapon? Was he saying someone had intentionally created a disease to spread? To harm people? Who would do something like that? She whispered, her voice shaky. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned off the highway, pulling the car onto a gravel road that led deeper into the woods. Andrea's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The woods were thick, the trees casting deep shadows over the road, and she saw no signs of other cars or homes nearby. The isolation of it all only heightened the sense of unease that had settled over her. "I don't know who started it, Andrea," David said, his voice distant, as if he were lost in thought. "I don't know who's behind it, but I know it's real. I've seen the effects firsthand. It's spreading fast, and it's going to get worse. People, good people, people you trust, they've already been exposed." Andrea's mind spun, trying to grasp the enormity of what David was saying. A bioweapon. People she knew, people in her life, could be infected. The entire world could be on the brink of something horrific, and they were caught in the middle of it. David took a sharp turn, and the car came to a stop in front of a large, secluded cabin tucked deep in the woods. The place looked rustic, weathered by time, but there was something about it that seemed safe, like a hidden sanctuary. "This is where we're staying for now," David said, killing the engine. No one knows about this place except for a few people I trust. It's off the grid, so we should be safe for a while. Andrea couldn't shake the feeling that they had just entered the heart of a conspiracy. But she didn't have a choice. She had to follow him. For Emily's sake. For her own sake. Come on, David said, his voice softer now. Let's get inside. They got out of the car, and David led Andrea up to the door of the cabin. The woods around them seemed to stretch on endlessly, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. As they entered the cabin, Andrea's eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The space was sparsely furnished but functional, with just enough to make it livable. It wasn't a luxury retreat, but it was clean and well-kept. Okay, let's sit down and talk, David said, motioning toward a couch in the corner of the room. Andrea hesitated for a moment, then sat down, her heart pounding with anticipation. She needed to know everything. She couldn't live in fear, not knowing what was coming. David followed her, sitting down beside her, but his eyes never fully met hers. I need to tell you everything, Andrea, he began, his voice low. You deserve to know the truth. Andrea nodded, her mind still racing. Please, everything. David took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair before speaking again. Okay, here it is. The disease that's spreading, it's not a natural one. It's not something that just happened. It's man-made. A virus created by a group of scientists, but not just any scientists, government-funded researchers. There's an organization, a shadow group, that's been working on this project for years. They call it Project Genesis. The virus was engineered to target specific genetic markers in people. It's designed to be deadly to certain individuals, but it's a slow process. Andrea's eyes widened in disbelief. Wait, are you saying they're targeting people? People like me? David nodded grimly. Yes, you, me, Emily. Anyone who falls into the right genetic profile. The virus attacks the immune system, weakens it, and then it becomes a death sentence. The symptoms don't show up until it's too late to stop. Andrea felt a chill run down her spine. This couldn't be real. Couldn't. But why, David? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would anyone do that? Why would they target innocent people like us? David looked away for a moment, clearly struggling with the answer. I don't know. I wish I could explain it, but I don't have all the answers. I've only been able to piece together fragments. But I've been working with a group of former scientists who defected from the organization. They're trying to stop it, to find a cure. But it's complicated. There are people who don't want this to stop, people who want the virus to spread. And they'll do anything to keep it quiet. Andrea's mind was reeling. A bioweapon, a conspiracy, a deadly virus. It was too much to process all at once. And yet, there was no denying the truth in David's eyes. He was scared. Scared for her. Scared for Emily. What do we do now? Andrea asked, her voice trembling. David turned to her, his expression filled with determination. We fight back. We stay ahead of them. And we find a way to stop it. But Andrea couldn't help but feel a wave of dread wash over her. They were at the mercy of people she didn't understand, fighting an enemy she couldn't see. The world she had known was gone, replaced by a darker reality where nothing was certain. And as the cabin door creaked closed behind them, Andrea realized there was no turning back. Chapter 4: Fractured Trust. The small cabin was silent, save for the distant calls of birds in the trees outside and the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth. Andrea sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly together, her mind racing with the weight of everything she had just learned. David had told her the truth, the whole truth, or at least what he knew of it. But the enormity of it all felt unreal, like some bad dream she couldn't wake up from. In the hours since their arrival, David had kept his distance, clearly wrestling with his own demons. He had gone to check the perimeter of the cabin, making sure no one had followed them, and had only returned a short time ago. Andrea had tried to focus, tried to pull herself together, but every thought seemed to spiral into another question, another fear she couldn't answer. Emily, their daughter, had been asleep upstairs since they arrived, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation. It was a relief in some ways. Andrea didn't want her to feel the weight of the world pressing down on them. Not yet. But the longer they stayed here, the more Andrea realized how impossible it was to protect her from the danger that was already closing in. David had been distant ever since he confessed the truth. The bond they once shared felt like it had splintered in an instant. He wasn't the same man she had married. Not anymore. And maybe she wasn't the same woman either. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned to find David standing there, his silhouette dark against the light of the cabin. He looked exhausted, the lines of stress etched deeper on his face. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made Andrea's heart skip a beat. "Is everything secure?" she asked, her voice betraying her own unease. David stepped inside, his gaze flickering briefly toward Emily's bedroom door before resting on Andrea. "For now," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice made the words ring hollow. "But we can't stay here long. It's only a matter of time before they find us." Andrea swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach tightening. "Who are they, David? And why are we the ones being targeted? You still haven't told me the whole story." David took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his own secrets was too much to bear. "I told you what I knew. I can't give you all the answers, Andrea. Not yet, but I'm working on it. I need to find the people who can help us." Andrea stood up, her frustration boiling over. "You keep saying that, but I'm not getting any answers. I need to understand what we're up against, David. I need to know who these people are and why they want to hurt us." David's eyes hardened, the vulnerability from moments ago now replaced by a guarded resolve. "You don't understand, Andrea. This isn't just some conspiracy. It's bigger than that. If we go to the wrong people, if we trust the wrong people," he trailed off, shaking his head, "we'll be signing our death warrants." Her pulse quickened at the cold certainty in his voice. "What do you mean? You can't just leave us in the dark like this. If you've got a plan, if there's someone who can help us, tell me who they are. I'm not going to sit here and wait for you to fix everything on your own." David looked torn, as though he wanted to explain everything but couldn't find the words. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze flicking to the window as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. I don't want you to get involved, Andrea. I didn't want any of this for you. I thought I could protect you, protect Emily. But this is bigger than I ever imagined." Andrea's eyes narrowed, a sense of betrayal creeping into her chest. "You've been lying to me, David. All this time, you've kept me in the dark. And now you expect me to just follow you blindly because you say it's for our safety? You've put us in danger by keeping these secrets, and I can't do it anymore." David flinched, the accusation hanging in the air like a weight. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just stared at her, a man caught between his duty to protect his family and the realization that he had failed them in ways he couldn't undo. "I'm sorry, Andrea," he whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen. But we're running out of time. I don't know who we can trust anymore." Andrea's heart pounded in her chest as the realization struck her like a punch to the gut. She had trusted David with everything: her love, her future, their family's safety. But now, she didn't know if she could trust him anymore. The man she had married was a stranger, and the world around them had become a maze of lies and uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do this, David," Andrea said, her voice cracking. "I don't know if I can keep going like this, not knowing who to trust or where we're even headed. I need something, some kind of certainty. I need to know you're not hiding more from me." David's face softened for a moment, and he took a hesitant step toward her. "I'm not hiding anything more, Andrea. I swear to you, but there are things I can't explain." "Not yet." Andrea shook her head, the tears she had been holding back finally breaking free. "It's all too much. I just want things to go back to normal." David reached for her, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on her shoulder. "I wish I could give you that. I really do. But the world we knew, it's gone. We have to face the truth, together, if we're going to survive this." Andrea closed her eyes, her body trembling from the weight of the fear and frustration she felt. The world she had known had shattered in an instant, replaced by something unrecognizable and terrifying. And even though she was with David, even though they were in this together, She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing him piece by piece, that the man she had loved was slipping away, consumed by the very secrets he had kept to protect her. "How much longer do we have?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. David's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I don't know. A day, a week, maybe less. We can't stay here for long. We have to keep moving." The words hung in the air, a grim reminder that the future they had planned together was slipping further from their grasp with each passing moment. But despite the fear that gripped her, despite the uncertainty, Andrea knew one thing for sure. She would protect Emily at all costs, even if it meant facing a world full of shadows and lies. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was still shrouded in doubt. "I'll protect Emily, and I'll protect you. But I need to know everything." David's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Andrea saw the man she had once known, the one she had married. But even as his hand touched hers, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. They were trapped in a web of conspiracy, running from enemies they couldn't even see. And the longer they stayed on the run, the more Andrea wondered if they were even safe anymore. Chapter 5: Shattered Illusions. The soft hum of the wind was the only sound as Andrea stared out of the cabin's single window, watching the trees sway in the distance. The isolation of the place felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in around her. The weight of everything, David's secrets, the bioweapon, the threats that loomed over them, felt heavier with each passing moment. It had been 2 days since their arrival, and despite the distance they had put between themselves and the dangers lurking in the outside world, Andrea couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the trees outside, sent a chill down her spine. She knew they couldn't stay here forever, but the thought of moving again, of running yet again, seemed more terrifying than the dangers they had left behind. David was on the phone again, his voice low and urgent. She hadn't been able to make out the words, but the tension in his tone was enough to tell her that they were running out of time. The conversation ended quickly, and he hung up the phone with a defeated sigh. "Who was it?" Andrea asked, her voice tinged with frustration. David turned to her, his face tight with the same unreadable expression he had worn since they left Maplewood. "A contact. He's been tracking the virus. They've confirmed it's spreading faster than we thought." "Faster?" Andrea's heart skipped a beat. "You mean it's already worse than we realized?" David interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just a bioweapon anymore. They've weaponized it. There's no cure. And now they're targeting key individuals, people who are either part of the original research or who are genetically predisposed to the virus." Andrea's blood ran cold. "What does that mean for us? For Emily?" David's gaze darkened. "It means they'll stop at nothing to find us. The virus is just the beginning. We're targets, Andrea. All of us." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Everything she had thought she understood about safety and family suddenly shattered. How had they ended up here? How had everything turned upside down so quickly? David's words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. Andrea struggled to process them, but it was as though her mind couldn't quite make sense of the terrible implications. She had always thought of herself as a survivor. She had navigated her career, her family life, and even the ups and downs of her marriage with determination and strength. But this was something beyond her comprehension. "How do we fight something like this?" Andrea finally asked, her voice trembling with a fear she couldn't fully hide. David stepped closer, his expression softening for a moment. "I don't know, but we're not alone in this. There are people, good people, working to stop it. They've been trying to find a way to neutralize the virus." "Who are they?" Andrea asked, desperate for any sliver of hope. David hesitated, then looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "They're former government researchers. They defected when they realized what the project had become. But we can't trust anyone right now. Not even them." Andrea's mind spun. Former government researchers? People who knew about the virus? Her heart pounded as the weight of the situation came crashing down. They were being hunted, and the very people who might have been able to help them were as much of a threat as those chasing them. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice low. "We just keep running?" David looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his options. He seemed exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, and for the first time, Andrea saw just how much this was taking out of him. "I don't know, but I'm not going to stop fighting. Not for you, not for Emily. We'll find a way to survive. We have to." Andrea wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that, despite everything, they could make it out of this alive. But the more she learned, the more she realized how powerless they were. The system, the virus, the shadowy figures pulling the strings, none of it made sense. And with every new revelation, she couldn't shake the feeling that their fate was being decided by forces far beyond their control. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the woods outside, Andrea sat on the worn-out couch in the living room, her thoughts spiraling. Emily had come downstairs to eat, and for a brief moment, Andrea allowed herself to be consumed by the simplicity of the moment, by the sound of Emily's laughter as she asked about dinner, by the warmth of the cabin, by the fleeting normalcy they still had. But the peace didn't last. Not when David came into the room, his face ashen, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice urgent. Andrea's heart stopped. "What's going on?" David's gaze flicked to Emily, who had stopped mid-bite, sensing the change in the air. "It's them. They found us." The words hit Andrea like a punch to the stomach. "How?" "We've been careful." David shook his head, his voice tight with dread. "They're tracking us. I don't know how, but they're here. We don't have much time." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. Andrea's mind raced. How could they have found them? How had their small, hidden cabin been compromised? "We need to go, now," David repeated, his urgency matching the panic creeping into Andrea's chest. "Emily, get your things. We're leaving." Emily's wide eyes filled with confusion, and Andrea could see the fear beginning to cloud her daughter's face. She rushed to gather her things, her tiny hands trembling with the weight of the moment. The world outside the cabin suddenly seemed too large, too dangerous, and Andrea's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. As they hastily packed what they could, Andrea's mind raced through their options. They couldn't go back to the city. They couldn't go anywhere familiar. And the further they ran, the closer they seemed to be to a trap. David was already at the door, his hand on the handle. "Let's go. We don't have time to waste." Andrea moved to follow him, but before she reached the door, a voice, cold and deliberate, rang out from behind them. "Going somewhere?" Andrea froze. The voice sent an icy shiver down her spine. Slowly, she turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, tall, dark, and familiar. A man from David's past. Someone who shouldn't be here. "Who the hell are you?" David's voice was low, full of anger and disbelief. The man stepped closer, his gaze flickering between David and Andrea. "I think you know who I am, David. But it doesn't matter now. You're out of time." Chapter 6. Crossroads. The man stood in the doorway like a shadow, his presence heavy in the room. The soft rustle of Emily's movements as she clutched her small backpack, ready to flee, was the only sound that dared break the suffocating silence. David's face was a mixture of disbelief and rage. His jaw clenched so tightly it seemed as if his teeth might shatter. The muscles in his neck tensed, and Andrea could see him trying to figure out whether the man before them was friend or foe. But there was no doubt in his eyes. This man was no stranger. He was a part of David's past, someone tied to secrets Andrea didn't even know existed. "Luca," David spat, his voice cold. "What the hell are you doing here?" Luca's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and something darker. He stood just beyond the threshold, blocking the exit, his body language casual but imposing. "You're a hard man to track down, David," Luca said, his tone almost friendly, but Andrea could sense the danger underneath. "But it's nothing personal. You know that, right?" David's eyes narrowed, his hands subtly moving towards the door, a plan forming in his mind. But Andrea could see the hesitation in his movements. He wasn't sure how far Luca was willing to go, or if he was willing to fight for their escape. "We're leaving," David said, his voice firm but strained. "This is none of your business." Luca's eyes flicked to Andrea and then to Emily, who was clinging to Andrea's side, her face a mixture of confusion and fear. The look Luca gave Emily was unsettling, like he was measuring her worth for something. Something Andrea couldn't quite place but instinctively feared. "I think you're mistaken, David," Luca replied, his tone hardening. "It's very much my business. You've been running from this for a long time, but it's caught up with you. And with her." He nodded toward Andrea. "You've made a lot of mistakes. Trusting her. Trusting anyone." Andrea felt a chill slide down her spine. She turned to David, her heart racing. "What does he mean, David? What's he talking about?" David's expression faltered, and for a split second, Andrea saw something like regret in his eyes. He didn't answer her. He couldn't. Luca, sensing the opening, took a step closer, his gaze now fixed solely on Andrea. "David's been keeping secrets, you know," he said, his voice light, almost teasing. "A lot of them. But it's not too late to make a choice, Andrea. You could still walk away from this. You could still choose the right side." Andrea's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What side? What has David been keeping from me?" David's hand shot out, grabbing Luca's arm with surprising strength. "Don't say another word." But Luca didn't flinch. He stood there, unmoved, almost enjoying the tension that hung thick in the air. "David's always been good at keeping secrets, hasn't he?" Luca continued, ignoring the warning. "But you deserve to know, Andrea. The truth. Everything he's been involved in. The people he's worked for. It's all a game to him, and you've been the pawn." The words hit Andrea like a physical blow. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe as the implications of what Luca was saying started to sink in. What did he mean by the people he's worked for? What game was David playing? And why hadn't he told her any of it? David's grip on Luca's arm tightened, and for a moment, Andrea saw the raw intensity in his eyes. There was fear, yes, but there was also something else. A desperation to protect her, to protect Emily, no matter the cost. "Enough," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave now, Luca. You don't know what you're dealing with." Luca let out a mocking laugh, his eyes flashing. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with, David. It's not just about you anymore. You think you're in control, but there's a much bigger picture here. You're running from something you can't escape. You should have never brought her into this." David's breath hitched, and Andrea could see the wheels turning in his mind. Luca's words were like a mirror, reflecting everything David had hidden from her. The walls he'd built between them were starting to crumble, and she could no longer ignore the fact that her husband was a man she barely recognized. A man who had lied to her. A man who had dragged her into a world she didn't understand, and who had kept her in the dark for far too long. "No," David said, his voice wavering for the first time. "I didn't want any of this for you, Andrea. I didn't want you to know." Andrea took a deep breath, the weight of his confession settling over her like a suffocating blanket. "Then why, David? Why didn't you tell me? Why keep me in the dark?" Luca smirked, stepping back as he sized up the situation. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said. "Why?" Because he knows that once you know, once you're part of this, there's no turning back. He wanted to protect you, but in doing so, he's dragged you both into something far worse than you ever could have imagined. David's eyes locked onto Andrea's, his face full of pain and regret. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. "I thought I could fix it. But now it's too late." Andrea's mind raced. Every word Luca spoke, every confession David made, was like a piece of glass cutting into her heart. How could this be happening? How could the man she had married, the man she had loved, be a part of something so dangerous? Emily, sensing the growing tension, tugged at Andrea's sleeve. "Mommy, what's happening? Why is he so angry?" Andrea knelt down beside her daughter, her heart breaking for the innocent girl who had been thrust into a nightmare that she couldn't possibly understand. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, brushing Emily's hair back from her face. "Everything will be okay. We'll figure it out." Luca's voice cut through the moment. "Don't bother trying to protect her, Andrea. She's already involved. Whether you like it or not. David's expression shifted. Anger, fear, and determination blending in a way that Andrea had never seen before. He stepped between Luca and his family, a clear message in his stance. "I said leave," David commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Luca's gaze flickered to David, then back to Andrea and Emily. For a moment, Andrea saw him weigh his options, deciding whether to continue the confrontation or take a step back. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his tone casual, "but don't think you've heard the last of me. You'll regret this." He turned, disappearing into the woods without another word, leaving the cabin quiet again, save for the sound of Andrea's heartbeat pounding in her ears. The air in the room seemed to settle, but the tension between David and Andrea remained thick. She could feel the space between them widening, the walls of their relationship crumbling. Trust, once the foundation of everything they had built, was now fragile and brittle. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did he mean? What is this all about?" David's shoulders slumped as he turned to face her. The silence stretched between them, suffocating and heavy. Finally, he met her gaze, his eyes full of regret, full of a kind of resignation Andrea couldn't quite place. "Everything I've done, Andrea, it's all been to keep you safe. I never wanted you involved in any of this. But now it's too late." He took a long, shuddering breath. "The world you knew is gone, and I'll do anything to make sure you both survive." The room was silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air, unresolved and unfinished. The question loomed between them. Was survival enough? Would they be able to protect Emily? And was there any way forward from the shattered illusions that had come crashing down around them? Chapter 7. The Price of Truth. The night hung heavy over the cabin. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, bending the branches and sending shadows dancing against the walls. Inside, the only light came from the dim glow of the fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. But despite the warmth, Andrea felt a coldness creeping in, not from the weather, but from the terrifying truths that had been uncovered in the last few days. David hadn't spoken since Luca had left, and neither had Andrea. The weight of the conversation, the questions, the guilt, they all seemed to hang in the air, suffocating them. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, her small form curled up under a blanket, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding them. David was standing by the window, staring out into the night. His back was to Andrea, but she could feel the tension in his shoulders, the way his body seemed to be coiled, ready to spring into action at any moment. She wanted to reach out to him, to ask him everything that was still left unsaid, but she couldn't bring herself to break the silence. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted you to know any of this," he said, his tone thick with regret. "I wanted to protect you, Andrea, but I failed. I've put you in the middle of something I can't control, and I don't know if we can get out of it." Andrea didn't know how to respond. She wanted to be angry, to demand answers, to make him explain everything. But part of her understood why he had done it, why he had kept the truth from her. He had always been the protector, the one who kept her and Emily safe from the chaos of the world. He'd built walls around them, trying to shield them from the horrors he had been involved in. But now, those walls were crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. "David," she said, her voice breaking the stillness, "what is it you're not telling me? What is this game you've been playing? And who are these people you're working with?" David turned around slowly, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I never worked with them willingly," he said, his voice rough. "But I've been involved with things I can't take back. It started when I was recruited by a government program. I thought I was doing something good, something that would help people. But I was wrong." Andrea's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of his words. A government program? Something good? She had known David had worked in a high-stress, high-risk job, but this? She had never imagined it could be anything like this. He took a deep breath and walked over to her, sitting down on the edge of the couch, his eyes never leaving hers. They were studying the virus, Andrea, the one Luca was talking about. At first, it was just research, genetic modification, trying to find ways to combat diseases. But then it became something else. It became about power, about control. Andrea's heart pounded in her chest. What do you mean? Control over what? Over who? David ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with the words. The virus was never meant to be a weapon at first, but the people behind it, they saw its potential. It became a tool for control, over nations, over economies. It was designed to eliminate certain populations, to change the balance of power. Andrea felt as if the ground beneath her was giving way. The world she thought she knew, everything she believed in, was falling apart, piece by piece. You mean they wanted to use it to kill people? To manipulate populations? David nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. Yes, and I was part of it. I didn't know the full extent at first. I thought I was just doing my job, helping to develop a cure for something that didn't even exist yet. But then I found out what they were planning. And by the time I realized how deep I was in, it was too late. Andrea felt a wave of nausea roll through her. So, Luca's right? You've been working with these people, these monsters? And now, you're dragging us into it. David's eyes flashed with pain. I never wanted this for you. I swear, Andrea. The moment I realized what was really happening, I tried to get out. But they don't let you leave. Once you're in, they own you. A heavy silence fell between them, the weight of his confession sinking into Andrea's bones. The man she had married, the man she had trusted more than anyone, had been part of something unimaginable. And now, she was a part of it, too. She had been dragged into a world she didn't understand, a world that seemed to devour everything in its path. I had to protect you, David continued, his voice shaking. I had to make sure you didn't get involved. I thought I could keep you safe, but now it's all falling apart. And I don't know how to fix it. Andrea's heart ached as she looked at him. The man she loved was breaking in front of her, and she didn't know how to help him, how to help them. David, she whispered, what do we do now? He looked at her, his eyes filled with desperation. I don't know, but we can't stay here. If they find us, it's over. They'll come for Emily, for you. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Andrea felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The danger was no longer a distant threat. It was here, closing in on them. And as much as she hated to admit it, she knew they couldn't stay at the cabin forever. The safety they had once felt was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. She turned to look at Emily, still asleep on the couch, completely unaware of the storm swirling around them. Andrea's heart broke for her daughter. Emily deserved a life of peace, not a life of hiding and running. What about Emily? Andrea asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How do we protect her? David's expression softened as he looked at their daughter. We'll keep her safe. I promise. But Andrea knew that promises weren't enough anymore. They had no control over what was coming. The world they had once known was gone, replaced by a twisted reality where survival was the only thing that mattered. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. The sound echoed through the cabin, making Andrea's blood run cold. David's head whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. They found us, he whispered. Andrea's heart raced as she grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her into her arms. She could feel the girl's heartbeat quickening, could feel the fear radiating from her small body. She didn't understand what was happening, but Andrea knew that the world had just become much more dangerous than they had ever imagined. David moved quickly, grabbing the only weapon they had, a small, metal rod from the fireplace, and silently moved toward the door. Stay back, he ordered Andrea, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Andrea didn't argue. She crouched down next to Emily, trying to keep her calm. But the fear that had taken hold of her was consuming, suffocating. What would they do if the people who were hunting them had found them? What were they willing to do to get what they wanted? As the door creaked open, Andrea's heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was not the enemy they had expected. It wasn't the government agents or the shadowy figures David had warned her about. It was someone Andrea had never expected to see again. And that person was holding something in their hand that would change everything. Chapter 8. A familiar face. The door creaked open slowly, the faint light from the cabin's dim interior casting a long shadow over the figure standing outside. Andrea's heart was racing, her mind scrambling to make sense of the unexpected turn of events. David, standing rigid with the metal rod in his hand, stared at the newcomer as if trying to decide whether to trust what his eyes were seeing. Andrea felt a rush of conflicting emotions, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and an unexpected sense of recognition. The figure standing at the door was not a stranger. Isabel? Andrea gasped, her voice shaking. Isabel Harper, an old friend from Andrea's college days, stood there in the doorway, her wide, worried eyes scanning the room. She looked different now, older, more worn, but Andrea could see the familiar spark of the woman she had once shared laughter and secrets with. There was no mistaking her. David, who had been poised to strike at any moment, lowered the metal rod in disbelief. He stared at Isabel as if unsure whether his mind was playing tricks on him. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice tense but laced with confusion. Isabel didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked past David to Andrea and then down to Emily, who was still tucked protectively in Andrea's arms. The scene before her clearly wasn't what she had expected, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unspoken understanding. "I know this looks strange," Isabel said slowly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "But we don't have time for explanations right now. You're all in danger, and I'm here to help." Andrea's mind was reeling. "Help? Help us with what? What's going on, Isabel?" David shot Andrea a questioning glance, his face still etched with suspicion. His grip on the rod tightened, but he didn't raise it again. It was as if he recognized the weight of the moment, that this woman, despite being an unexpected figure in their already dangerous life, might hold the answers they were desperate for. Isabel took a deep breath, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if making sure they weren't being watched. "I never wanted you to be involved in this, Andrea," she began, her voice low but firm. "But I've been tracking you. I've been tracking him," she said, pointing toward David. "And I had to find you. You don't understand just how deep this goes. I wasn't sure if I'd ever get to you in time." Andrea felt her blood run cold. "Tracking us? What do you mean? Why? How do you even know what's happening?" Isabel closed the door behind her and took a few steps forward, lowering her voice further. "Because I've been working with the same people David has. But I don't have the same history with them. I don't have the blood on my hands that he does." David's face turned pale at her words. Andrea noticed how he stiffened, his jaw setting as though he was bracing himself for some sort of impact. Isabel turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with what appeared to be a mix of regret and something else. Something Andrea couldn't quite place. "You didn't tell her, did you?" Isabel asked David, the question hanging in the air. "You never told her about me." David's eyes flicked away, his gaze avoiding Andrea's. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I couldn't. I never wanted to bring you into it. I never wanted her to know." Isabel's expression softened. "I understand. You thought you were protecting her. You were wrong. But I understand why you did it." Andrea felt the walls closing in around her. "What's going on, Isabel? What is this all about?" Isabel took another step forward, standing in front of Andrea, her voice dropping even lower. "I've been in contact with people who have information that you don't have. They know about the virus, about everything David has been involved in. And they know about you, Andrea. They know about your daughter." Emily stirred in Andrea's arms, sensing the tension in the room. Isabel's gaze softened as she looked at the child, and for the first time since she entered, her face showed a glimmer of warmth. "Your daughter is the key to everything," Isabel said gently. "She doesn't know it yet, but she's more important than you realize." The words hit Andrea like a ton of bricks. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her heart thudding against her chest. "What does Emily have to do with this?" Isabel paused, her eyes darting to David before returning to Andrea. She hesitated for a long moment, as if trying to decide just how much to reveal. "She has a genetic mutation," Isabel said finally, her voice grim. "It's linked to the virus, and it's the key to everything, how the virus spreads, how it can be stopped, maybe even how it can be used. And there are people who would do anything to get their hands on her. Andrea's breath caught in her throat. No, no, that's not possible. She's just a child. Isabel stepped closer, her eyes intense. I know it's hard to understand, but Emily's DNA could hold the answers to saving countless lives. Or destroying them. There are factions involved in this, factions that will stop at nothing to control the virus and its spread. And they want her. They've known about her for a while. And they've been tracking her since she was born. David's face was drawn, his eyes dark with a mixture of shame and sorrow. I didn't know how to protect her from this. I thought I could keep her safe, but they've been watching. It's never been just about me, Andrea. It's been about her. Andrea's mind was spinning. She had always known there was something special about her daughter, something that made her unique. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. But why didn't you tell me? Andrea asked, her voice shaky. Why didn't you warn me, David? David swallowed hard, his throat working as if he were trying to find the right words. Because I thought I could fix it. I thought I could protect you both from the truth. I didn't want you to be involved in this nightmare. I didn't want to see the fear in your eyes. The way you're looking at me now. Andrea's chest ached. So, what do we do now? What do we do with this information? Isabel stepped in, her voice full of urgency. Now we move. We can't stay here. They're coming. We need to get you out of here, and we need to do it now. David nodded, his expression determined, as if he finally understood the gravity of the situation. We have to leave. It's the only way we're going to keep Emily safe. Andrea's heart raced with the weight of everything she had just learned. They had been running from something, yes, but now it was clear. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting Emily, the key to everything. As Isabel turned toward the door, David took Andrea's hand, squeezing it tightly. It's going to be okay, he said, though his voice wavered with doubt. But Andrea wasn't sure anymore. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a dangerous, unforgiving reality. And no matter how hard they fought, no matter how hard they tried to protect Emily, there was one thing Andrea was certain of. Their lives would never be the same. The sound of a distant engine rumbled in the night, and Isabel's eyes flicked toward the window. We need to go. Now. Chapter 9. The Brink of Discovery. The rush of cold air hit Andrea like a slap in the face as they stepped outside into the night. The cabin's warmth, the familiar comfort of home, was now a distant memory. Isabel led the way, her pace quick and determined as she moved toward the woods behind the house. Andrea's mind was still racing, trying to process everything she had learned in the past few hours. Emily, now awake and clinging to her side, looked up at her with wide, confused eyes. Mom, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. What's going on? Who was that lady? Andrea knelt down and pulled Emily into a tight embrace, trying to mask her own fear. I'll explain everything later, sweetie. Just stay close. Okay? But even as she spoke, Andrea's mind was already on the edge of panic. She had to protect Emily. She had to keep her safe. And she had to figure out what Isabel had meant by Emily being the key to everything. The girl she loved more than anything in the world was now at the center of a conflict far larger than they could possibly comprehend. Behind them, David closed the door with a soft thud, his footsteps quickening as he caught up to them. He was scanning the trees, his eyes constantly darting from shadow to shadow. The night felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of what was coming. Isabel glanced back, her eyes sharp with concern. We don't have much time. We need to reach the vehicle before they realize we've left. David frowned. Who's they? Who's coming after us? Isabel? She didn't answer right away, instead quickening her pace. The crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet was the only sound breaking the silence of the night, but Andrea could feel the tension building. Every footstep felt like a countdown, every breath they took like it might be their last. It's them, Isabel said finally, her voice tight. The ones David's been running from. They're not far behind, and once they know you're out of the cabin, they'll come for you. Andrea felt a sickening weight settle in her stomach. She had never known the full truth of what David had been involved in, but hearing it now, knowing that they were being hunted by shadowy forces who had been tracking them for years, It was overwhelming. The woods around them felt alive with danger, and Andrea's thoughts began to spiral. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig underfoot, made her heart race. She glanced down at Emily, who was still clinging to her side, her small hand clutching Andrea's tightly. "Stay close," Andrea whispered again, brushing her daughter's hair out of her face. Isabel led them through the dense woods at a breakneck pace, her movements fluid and confident. She had been here before. Andrea could tell this wasn't her first time running from danger. David, on the other hand, was moving slower, his posture tense, eyes scanning their surroundings constantly. They reached the edge of the woods, and in the distance, Andrea saw the outline of a vehicle parked on the far side of the clearing. It was a nondescript black SUV, and something about it made her feel a little bit safer. The urgency in Isabel's movements suggested they had to move fast. "Hurry," Isabel urged. "We have to get to the car. I'll explain everything on the way." "But we don't have time to waste." David pushed forward, his face set in determination. Andrea's mind swirled with questions, with thoughts of everything that had happened since the moment she'd learned the truth about the virus, about Emily, about David's involvement in this entire nightmare. She reached the SUV first, but as she went to open the door, a sound pierced the silence. Something loud, something unmistakable. Car engine. Her blood ran cold. Isabel's eyes widened in alarm. "Get in the car. Now!" David had already slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel with white knuckles. Andrea shoved Emily into the back seat and followed quickly, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, closer. Isabel jumped into the front seat, slamming the door behind her. "Go, David, go!" she shouted, her voice sharp. David didn't hesitate. He slammed the pedal to the floor, and the SUV lurched forward, tires screeching as they sped down the narrow dirt road that led away from the cabin. The headlights from the approaching car illuminated the trees in the distance, but they were already too far away to catch up. For a moment, Andrea allowed herself to breathe, just for a second. The danger hadn't caught them yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they would be pursued, and they wouldn't have much more time to run. "Where are we going?" Andrea asked, her voice low, as she tried to steady her breathing. Isabel turned to her, her face serious. "We need to go to a place where they can't find us. A safe house. It's the only place we'll have a chance to lay low." "A safe house," Andrea echoed, her mind racing. "How do we know they won't find us there too?" Isabel's gaze was filled with an intensity that left no room for argument. "Trust me, I've been in this world long enough to know the safest places. But we can't stay in one spot for long. Not now." David glanced over at her, his eyes still alert, his hands steady on the wheel. "And what about the virus? The people David's been involved with?" he asked. "How do we stop them from coming after us?" Isabel's expression darkened, and she looked out the windshield, as if the weight of the situation was finally hitting her too. It's not just about stopping them. It's about surviving long enough to stop the bigger plan. The virus was never just a weapon, Andrea. It's a tool, a weapon of control. And it's not just a matter of eliminating it. It's about controlling it. We need to protect Emily at all costs. She's the key to everything. Emily, who had been unusually quiet, shifted in the back seat. She had been listening, Andrea realized, even if she didn't understand the full gravity of what was happening. "What's wrong with me, Mom?" she asked softly, her innocent voice cutting through the tension in the car. Andrea's heart clenched, and she turned to face her daughter, trying to find the right words. "Nothing's wrong with you, sweetheart," she said gently. "You're special, though. You've always been special. But there are people who want to hurt you to get what's inside you." Emily looked confused, but she nodded slowly, as if trying to make sense of what she was hearing. As the car roared down the road, the landscape around them began to blur, the trees and houses giving way to more open, desolate spaces. But Andrea couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They were running now, but for how long? And more importantly, how long would it be before the enemy closed in on them once again? Chapter 10. the final confrontation. The sound of the tires on the road was the only thing that filled the silence inside the SUV as they raced toward an uncertain future. Emily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her small body curled up in a ball against Andrea's side, oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their lives. David drove with a tight grip on the wheel, his jaw clenched in concentration, while Isabel sat beside him, her eyes darting to every passing shadow in the rearview mirror. Andrea could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her. The lies, the secrets, the uncertainty. She had come so far, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The safe house Isabel had promised them wasn't far now, but Andrea knew that their problems were far from over. The danger was closing in on them, and with each passing mile, the feeling of being hunted only intensified. "You okay?" David's voice cut through the tension, his eyes flicking briefly to Andrea. He knew what she was feeling, even without words. Andrea nodded, her heart heavy. "I'm fine. I just don't know how much longer we can keep running." David didn't respond, but his eyes narrowed. He had been running for so long, but the weight of his past was catching up to him now in ways he couldn't have imagined. What had started as a fight for survival had turned into a desperate race to protect the people he loved, to undo the damage he had done. Isabel broke the silence. "We need to hurry. We're not safe yet. There are people still following us." David's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white. "How much farther?" Isabel's expression was grim. "Not far. But we need to get there before they catch up. We can't outrun them forever." Andrea felt the growing sense of urgency pressing against her chest. The virus, the people after Emily, David's mysterious past. All of it was converging in ways she couldn't fully understand, but the pieces were falling into place. The truth was coming to light, and no matter how much she wished she could shield Emily from it all, Andrea knew it was too late for that. They reached the edge of a small, isolated town, the last remnants of civilization before the wilderness took over. The streets were empty at this hour, the houses dark and quiet. Isabel's instructions were clear. Take a left, follow the dirt road through the woods, and when they reached the clearing, they would find the safe house. David turned the wheel sharply, his tires kicking up gravel as they veered off the main road and onto a narrow, winding path that led into the forest. The headlights illuminated the dense trees, casting eerie shadows on the road ahead. Andrea could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on them, both literal and metaphorical. "You're sure this place is safe?" David asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "It has to be," Isabel replied, her voice sharp with conviction. "There's no other option. We have nowhere else to go." The SUV jolted as they hit a bump in the road, the motion causing Andrea to glance over at Emily, who stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. She felt a pang of guilt in her chest. Emily should never have been dragged into this, should never have had to carry the burden of being the key to something so dangerous. But the reality was inescapable. They were running out of time. The car continued down the road, and soon the trees started to thin, giving way to a small clearing. In the distance, Andrea saw the outline of a house. Small, unassuming, tucked away in the woods, just as Isabel had promised. The lights were dim, but the windows were dark, no signs of life visible. David slowed the car as they approached, his eyes scanning the area. "No signs of anyone," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Isabel nodded. "This is it. Stay close. We're not out of the woods yet." David parked the car, and the three of them stepped out into the cold night air, the distant sounds of the forest surrounding them. The wind was biting, sending a chill down Andrea's spine as they moved quickly toward the house. Emily, still sleepy, clung to Andrea's side, her small hand gripping her mother's with a quiet desperation. As they reached the porch, Isabel stepped forward and knocked firmly on the door. The sound echoed through the stillness of the night. Andrea held her breath, every instinct telling her to run, to get out of there before something went horribly wrong. She had no idea what was waiting for them inside, but the feeling of impending danger was palpable. The door creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A man, tall and thin, his face shadowed by the dim light from inside. "Isabel?" The man's voice was deep, hesitant. "What are you doing here?" "We need shelter," Isabel said quickly, her voice urgent. "They're following us. We don't have much time." The man glanced over at David and Andrea, his eyes flicking to Emily with a trace of recognition. "I figured you might be in trouble. Come inside. You're safe for now." The man stepped aside, and the group entered the house, their footsteps echoing in the small, sparse interior. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, and the man locked it immediately, the sound of the bolts sliding into place sending a jolt of unease through Andrea's body. As they settled into the house, the man, whose name Andrea learned was Samuel, went straight to the kitchen to prepare something. He didn't seem fazed by the tension in the air, as if he had seen it all before. Isabel pulled Andrea aside. "You need to know something. The people who are after us, they're not just a group of rogue agents. They're part of something much bigger. A corporation that's been studying the virus for years." David's face grew dark. "I know who they are. I've been trying to stop them. But they have resources. They have power. And they don't care who gets hurt in the process." Andrea swallowed hard. "And they'll stop at nothing to get to Emily." Isabel nodded gravely. "Exactly." David's eyes flicked to the window, his posture tense. "How long do we have before they come for us?" Samuel, who had been silently listening in the background, turned and spoke quietly. "A few hours, maybe less. But you won't be able to stay here long. We have a plan, but it's risky." Andrea felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on her chest. There was no running anymore, no hiding. The final confrontation was coming, and whether they were ready or not, they would have to face it head-on. "Then let's do it," Andrea said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Whatever it takes. We'll fight." Samuel nodded. "It's not going to be easy, but it's our best chance." As they gathered their things and prepared for what was to come, Andrea's thoughts turned to Emily, her daughter, the key to everything. They couldn't let the forces chasing them win. They couldn't let them control Emily's future or anyone else's. This was it, the endgame, the moment that would define their lives forever. The final confrontation was coming, and there was no turning back. The chapter ends with the group bracing for the inevitable showdown. The pieces have been set, the stakes couldn't be higher, and Andrea is faced with one final, crucial choice: protect Emily at all costs or risk losing everything.